Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. The elections in Kogi and Bayelsa states, as it stands, have left the All Progressives Congress with smiles as it made good its promise to take Bayelsa State, winning outright the governorship contest, even as it's still having a comfortable lead in Kogi State, where results declared by the Independent National Electoral Commission in 19 of 21 local government areas indicate that the APC may be certain of victory in Kogi State. Meanwhile, the Independent National Electoral Commission on Sunday declared as inconclusive the rerun of the election in Kogi West Senatorial District, held also on Saturday, because the margin of victory was less than the total number of cancelled votes. The elections were marred by violence, ballot snatching, and killing in the two states. And this, however, drew condemnation from the PDP and other stakeholders, which accused the military and the police of providing cover for hoodlums to unleash terror on voters and polling officials. Joining us this morning to discuss these and other issues is Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Welcome to the morning show, Professor Ibrahim. Good morning. Jibo.
Good morning.
Yes, good to have you on the morning show. You're welcome. Well, quickly,
it's my pleasure.
Yes, quickly, let me ask you, what's your assessment of what has happened in Kogi and Bayelsa states over the weekend? I mean, we've had such phrases from CDD, Idayat Azan, saying what happened in Bayelsa is a gunpoint democracy. We've had from Kogi State such phrases as, helicopter democracy. What's your own assessment in terms of the credibility and the integrity of the electoral processes in both states?
I'm extremely concerned, and I think Nigeria is taking a very serious, risk to its democratic order. The way I will characterize what happened, especially what we saw in Kogi State, where I came back from last night, is essentially the weaponization of electoral geography. Very many things happened. The first thing that happened was clearly certain actors have mapped the electoral geography. They knew where they had supporters, and they knew where people will vote against them. Where they will not receive a lot of votes, right before the elections, they made it clear that they'll put guns in the street to shoot people if they try to come out en masse to vote. And this, of course, is what's called voter suppression. Many people are afraid because they knew there'll be violence, so they wouldn't come out. The second thing they did was financial inducement. We saw very openly money is being paid both to electoral officials as well as to voters to determine how they vote during the elections. The third issue was they will target in opposition areas the polling units with the largest number of voters, send armed thugs inside those polling units, scatter everybody, and in many cases, collect the voting materials, including the ballots and ballot boxes, which means clearly there was very high-level collusion in the way in which those disruptions to the electoral process took place. The most worrying aspect was that there were clear orders that if you are not an electoral official or if you don't have official authorization, you cannot move around in vehicles. But we saw armed thugs with guns moving from polling unit to polling unit, which means there was clearly official collusion in giving them protection to disrupt the elections. All these are very disturbing indicators that electoral democracy is under serious threat in this country. And politicians should be very careful. The First and Second Republics collapsed because of this type of behavior. They should not push this country to the edge, and this weaponization of electoral geography must stop.
Well, indeed, some of the videos we saw were very disturbing, but you were on ground. And I'd like to talk about security, because in your preliminary report, which you have just highlighted, you did mention thuggery. And so I want to talk about security, because the police deployed 35,200 officers to Kogi State. In Bayelsa, it was about 31,000. And that's, you know, apart from other sister security agencies that were deployed for these elections. What was the reality on ground? Did these numbers match the security you saw on ground? I mean, you've talked about there was collusion, alleged collusion you are talking about between security agencies and political stakeholders who used thugs during these elections. But in general, did you see enough security on ground?
Definitely not. For example, in Kogi, we went from Lokoja all the way to Ajakuta. There wasn't a single police checkpoint. If the police deployed 35,000 police officers as they claimed, then this must be invincible officers, because there were very few checkpoints throughout Kogi State, which means two things. Definitely, the numbers that are claimed by the police cannot be accurate, but even if they are, there was a decision to withdraw police checkpoints so that armed thugs could move around freely. And this second possibility is even more worrying for me, because that's where I will point to evidence of collusion.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, the failure of the police, as you have described it, or maybe the security agencies, will it provide a justification for the involvement of the military in monitoring electoral processes on election day? Because you recall that before these particular two elections in Kogi and Bayelsa, one of the concerns, was that our elections are usually over-militarized. And INEC came forward to say that the military would take a back seat. Now, with the incompetence that has been demonstrated, do you think that, the military could help in the future?
I don't think bringing in the military is a solution. It may actually worsen the situation. In this country, we over-deploy the military for security issues that should be in the ambit of the Nigerian police force. But I think the problem with the Nigerian police is that sometimes they are used in a political way and their leadership accepts to such use. And the point really for me is that we need to sanitize the Nigerian police force. We need a police force that's neutral, that's effective, and that protects citizens as long as those citizens are obeying the law. That is the purpose for which the Nigerian police force was established. And the problem I'm raising is that sometimes the police is diverted from playing its constitutional role. It becomes partisan, it joins a side, it supports people who break the law instead of preventing people from breaking the law. The point, therefore, for me, is the reform of the Nigerian police force to make sure it does its constitutional duties.
Well, let's look at some of the measures put in place by stakeholders for credible elections and safe elections, one of which is the signing of peace accord. That's now a norm we see in Nigeria before elections. But with the level of violence you witnessed in Kogi State, is it safe to say that this signing of peace accord by political parties and critical stakeholders has become a mere formality and should be discarded?
Well, it shouldn't be discarded, but definitely it's not been done with the sincerity it requires. One of the things that struck me in Kogi State, for example, is that some of the people I was talking with showed me many songs that were composed in various local languages. And in those songs, they were saying clearly, We have the police on our side, we have the guns on our side, and we will deploy them against those who want to vote against us. Therefore, the point is, the violence that occurred did not just happen like that. It had been planned a long time before, that was the game plan. There was a strategy, and like I said at the beginning of my comments, this strategy involves the weaponization of electoral geography. People know who votes for who in Kogi State. There's a lot of ethnicity in terms of how people vote. So the key players knew what was going to happen in terms of electoral results if citizens are allowed to vote freely. So what they did was very selective
Ibrahim,
and careful
sorry
deployment.
to interrupt you, but we have to go on a quick commercial break. We'll be back to talk with you some more on the conduct of the Saturday elections in Kogi and Bayelsa. Stay with us. We'll be right back on The Morning Message. Welcome back to The Morning Show here on the Rise News. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow Center for Democracy and Development, is still with us from our Abuja studios. Thank you so much, Prof, for staying with us. Before that break, you were talking about how electoral violence are planned ahead. You want to continue on that line of thought?
Yes, the point I was making, people drew attention to war songs that have been sung and distributed widely, telling people that the guns are on their side and that specific areas where they are not going to vote for specific candidates, they would deploy those guns to make sure no voting occurs. At the same time, they were reassuring people that if you are on the right side of the vote, that is, you'll vote for the candidate you are told to vote for, there will be goodies for you. There will be money given to you. So it's this type of carrot and stick mechanism that's used to completely change what would have been the expected outcome of elections. And the problem with disturbing or deranging or transforming the expected outcome of elections is that people begin to give up on the electoral process as a pathway to political change. And that is very dangerous for our country. We've gone through it before, and the political consequences and the consequences for our democracy were terrible. That's how we lost the First Republic. That's how we lost the Second Republic. And we should be very careful that we don't lose the Fourth Republic to the weaponization of electoral geography and putting guns to replace ballots in terms of electoral outcomes.
Yes, quite correct. But based on what you saw in Kogi State and what you have described, what will you recommend to INEC? INEC already has declared as inconclusive the senatorial election in Kogi West. But it looks like, even the gubernatorial election from your account was terribly flawed. Will what would be your recommendation? Should INEC just cancel the election and then, organize another election? Or should we follow the usual path of the stakeholders going to court and then the courts to resolve whatever it is, since it looks like the electoral process is not producing reliable outcomes?
I think the first point is that you can't just tell INEC to cancel the elections because INEC is bound by law. There are specific procedures for canceling elections spelled out in the Electoral Act. And what those procedures say, what the law says, is that when you cancel an election, it has to be specific. It has to be a polling unit where the president of that electoral polling unit declares that those elections had lost their integrity. So that's the legal pathway that INEC has to follow. But my overriding point is really that this is something that goes far beyond INEC. When you allow thugs to go and break up peaceful voting, that's not an INEC issue. INEC doesn't have guns. INEC can't fight thugs. So that's a larger issue of the Nigerian state. The Nigerian state has a constitution. and we have laws that guide behavior. And we are very clear in our laws that during elections, you can't have unauthorized people with weapons going from polling unit to polling unit and disrupting the electoral process. That is a question for the Nigerian security sector to do its work as stipulated by law. So the problems are much larger than what INEC can handle. INEC can organize elections, but when third parties are allowed to come and disrupt those elections, INEC cannot do much. So my first recommendation is that INEC needs to carefully review what has happened all over those two states. They have to follow their own procedure as stipulated in the Electoral Act to cancel those where there was clear evidence there was either violence or there was theft of ballot papers or electoral materials and disruption to the process. After that, they can then make an assessment whether sufficient polling units conducted elections properly to legitimize the whole electoral process. So that's what INEC has to follow. Those parties that have aggrieved, as stipulated in the Constitution, need to take these things up at the level of the courts and the judicial system. But my most important message is that the Nigerian state has a responsibility to protect democratic processes and provide security for elections. It is failing in performing that duty. That responsibility is not being performed as it should be, and the state has to be very careful, the government has to be very careful that it does not risk the whole democratic process we have fought so hard to institutionalize in this country.
And let's talk about those things that undermine the choices of voters to make a decision about who rules them. Since we're talking about larger societal issues, a lot of people will say financial inducement is perhaps beyond INEC, despite the measures they've put in place to say, don't take your phones to the polling booth. But financial inducement is something that was very, very pronounced in these elections, in Kogi especially. In fact, we saw a returning officer, INEC official, bring evidence of 50,000 naira to the collation headquarters as evidence that, somebody was bribed, and it went all the ladder to him where he brought it. Just how widespread was financial inducement or vote buying, like they call it in Kogi State, and who were the bigger culprits that you saw?
Well, very clearly, financial inducement has become a very key part of the process of changing electoral outcomes in this country. And I think the way it's being done is very insidious. They make it clear to people, look, be rational. I'll give you 3,000 naira or 5,000 naira, and then you'll vote how I tell you to. And then they'll make you understand, if you don't want the good way, take the money and quietly do what we tell you, then we'll do it the difficult way. I'll call the thugs and they'll come and beat you up. So these are the types of choices voters are being offered. And it's a terrible choice where you sell your conscience to vote for somebody you may not have wanted to vote for, or you take the risk of physical harm to your own self. And I'm saying, in a democracy, you must never, never give voters those types of difficult choices to make. And that the use of financial inducement has terrible consequences for the democratic order. In particular, it affects the accountability of elected officials. Because if you know you are elected because you paid money for people to vote you, then you don't have any accountability to those people who you had paid off anyway and who are in your pocket, as it were. And that's the implication of financial inducement. And that's why I'm terribly against this new culture. Let me make the background point that Nigerian elections is very interesting. Previously, you remember the 2003, 2007 elections, nobody bothered to induce voters financially. What happened then was that the money will go to thugs, the money will go to electoral officials, the money will go to those who can determine outcomes, because they knew those elections were going to be rigged anyway, so the voter did not matter. 2011, 2015, when the integrity of the voting began to improve considerably, then politicians realized, oh, now voters are making decisions on who is elected and who is not. That was when direct bribes to voters started. Now, what's happening today in 2019 is there is no longer one strategy. They are using multiple strategies. Bribe those you can bribe, use guns against those you cannot bribe, disrupt the elections where you think the outcome will be against you, engage in voter suppression by making it difficult for people to come out and vote. So now we are in the era where the political class is engaged in using multiple approaches and strategies to determine these electoral outcomes in ways and manners that do not reflect the choices that voters would have been made. Well, in response to your question, which party is more...
Please go ahead.
Hello, yeah,
please
go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, I was trying to respond to the final question that which side is more guilty of voter inducement. And I want to make the fact that the main parties are all involved in voter inducement. And I'm not here to take the side of one party against the other. What I'm most concerned about is that only certain parties have control of the state apparatus and can influence the behavior of security agencies. And that's the most important one, because once you start using the security agencies for your own purposes, then it means you are compromising the neutrality of the state in protecting every citizen to make their choice. And that's the one that can most easily be handled. Once you've handled that, and your only problem is voter inducement, then that can be resolved, because if the elections are free and fair and there's no disruption to the elections, then voter inducement will not matter, because if people know they can still go and vote secretly and it will be counted, then they can take your money and vote for who they want. But it's by combining these strategies and putting both guns and money on the table for voters that it then becomes a difficult choice that blocks the capacity of the voter to feel they can vote freely for the candidate they would want to.
Well, still on the question of voter inducement, isn't there a sense in which the people themselves, in terms of their expectations, are complicit and acquiescent? Because, I mean, the point has been made that the only time the average voter sees a politician is election season. And the people just assume, well, let me collect what I can collect. In any case, I'm not likely to see them for the next 4 years. Someone was trying to explain this on another program yesterday to say, look, the crisis we really face with the voter is poverty. Is poverty a justification, apart from the threat of harm that you had identified earlier on?
I think the issue of financial inducement is a very complex one. I'll agree with you that some voters feel their only opportunity to get something from the politician is to collect the few thousand naira during the voting process, and they do that. And that's clearly happening. But the issue I'm looking at, what is the context? If a politician bribes a voter, in a context where the vote is free and fair, then that bribe may not have an impact because the voter will still go and vote for who he or she wants to. I know the politicians caught upon that one and said, okay, we want evidence that you actually voted for us. So photograph your ballot paper and show us who you vote for. In that case, you are blocking that freedom of the voter. And every responsible voter will say, no, you cannot determine for me, the sovereign citizen, who I will ultimately vote for. And it is in that context that for us in civil society, we've been trying to explain to the Nigerian voter that it's very dangerous for you to sell your vote because you are selling your conscience.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim. Thank you very much.